In this lesson, we'll introduce the Model View Controller architecture, which is the most commonly used architecture in web development. So far, we have covered lots of components of Java web applications: servlets, beans, JSP scripting elements, expression language, JSTL, and then there are the static resources like HTML pages and images, and metadata files like web.xml. We know that we can implement a web application with just servlets, or just JSPs, or some combination of these components. But the question is, what is the best way to do it? What is the best way to utilize all these tools to create web applications that are easy to develop and easy to maintain? And that's the question about architecture. People have studied several architectures for Java web applications. One of them is the Model 1 architecture. Under this architecture, a web application consists of beans and JSPs, where beans are used for business logic and JSPs are used for presentation. Our guestbook example with beans expression language and JSTL is an example of this architecture. The problem with Model 1 architecture is that if we use scripting elements in JSP, it makes this presentation with processing and creates all kinds of problems. But if we don't use scripting elements, the interaction between JSP and beans are limited to basically just getters and setters. Coding with this limitation is quite tedious, and sometimes it leads to bad workarounds like creating a fake setter in the guestbook example, which defeats the original intention to separate data modeling code from presentation code. If we look at the Model 1 architecture, we can notice that there seems to be something missing. We have beans, which are good for modeling data, and we have JSP, which are good for creating user interface. But other than data and presentation, there has to be something in an application that connects them together. And that leads us to the Model 2 architecture. Model 2 architecture is more commonly known as the Model View Controller architecture, or MVC. Under this architecture, an application can be divided into three parts: models that represent data, views that display the user interface, and controllers that handle all the processing. In a Java web application, models are usually implemented as beans, JSPs are used to create views, and servlets are used to implement controllers. This makes lots of sense because we know JSPs are good for generating HTML, and Java is good for data modeling and processing. This diagram shows how a request is processed in a web application with the Model View Controller architecture. First, the browser sends a request to the controller. The controller processes the request and, based on the request, updates some data. The controller then forwards the request and maybe some additional data to the view, and the view generates a response that is sent back to the browser. Keep in mind that in this class, we use servlets to implement controllers, beans to implement models, and JSP to implement views. With that knowledge, let's see how we can rewrite the guestbook example to use the MVC architecture. Here is the guestbook example. It's the servlet version. We have the guestbook entry class with three fields: ID, name, message. And then we have a number of servlets. The guestbook servlet creates a list of guestbook entries and display the guestbook in doGet. And then we have the add comment servlet, again displaying the form and then processing the form here, and then edit comment, which does the form display and then form processing in doPost. So as we can see, in this example, we already have roughly two components of an MVC. We have our model class here, and we have our controllers in the servlets. Well, they are not exactly the controllers per se, because in current implementation of the servlets, they are still doing the display part, which should be done in a view, in a actual MVC structured application. So let's change that. And in this example, again, we'll deal with three operations: the display operation, and then add comment, and then edit. So let's stop the server and make some changes to our code. First, we look at the guestbook entry class, and it looks perfectly fine as a model class. It has no dependency to any UI library. It doesn't depend on servlet API. It doesn't depend on Swing API. It can be used for either a desktop application or web application, and that's great. That's exactly what we need for data model class. And then for the display operation, we look at the guestbook servlet, and we look at each method one by one. The init method creates a list of guestbook entries and then store the list of entries in application scope. And this is what a controller is supposed to do: processing, handling data, and so on. So it's the same thing here. We keep that method as is. Now we look at doGet, and in doGet it displays a table which contains all the guestbook entries, and this is not something controller is supposed to do. Displaying or presentation part is for the views. So this is the part we need to change. To change that, we need to create a view, and that view, let's create a JSP for that, and we'll call it guestbook JSP, and it's right here. The reason I put guestbook JSP under web info is that I don't want the user to access this JSP directly. Notice that in a MVC architectured web application, the request always goes to controller. It never sends directly to view. So to prevent the user sending requests directly to view by accident or by some malicious intent, we can simply put our JSPs or our views under this special folder webinf so that they cannot access them directly. So we have our JSP here, and we'll probably need to use JSTL. So let me copy over the tag library and put it here. So this is our guestbook, and here we need to display the guestbook entries in a table, and we know how to do that. We create a table with a border, and the first row of the table will be the header row. We'll have, let's say, ID, and then name, and then message, and then we need to display each entry. We know that the entries are stored in the application scope, and the application scope data is shared among all the servlets and JSPs. So we can simply access that, and we'll use a for each loop, and items would be the entries, and each item, each item is an entry, and then we create a row for that. So it will be entry.id, and then entry.name, and then entry.message, just like that. Okay, so now this is our view, and let's go back to our controller. Let's close the model class. So instead of generating the view inside here, now we leave that for the controller. So everything here can be deleted. There is only one thing though. So we have a JSP here, and we have now our controller here, but somehow they are not connected together. So this is the main thing about this example, is how do we do this step? How do we forward the request from the controller to the view? In Servlet, this is done using a getRequestDispatcher forward. So this method is a method in the request object, and you call getRequestDispatcher and specify the path to the JSP, and then you forward the request and the response to that JSP, and that's that. So here we do a request, getRequestDispatcher, and then we specify the path to the JSP page, and that's webinf guestbook.jsp. Notice that this is a path relative to the application, so this gives us webinf and then this JSP. And then we say forward request response, and that's about it. And let's run this. Guestbook. So this is generated from our JSP page, right? Noticing that all the previous links to add comments, edit comments, and so on are all gone, because now it's generated from this JSP. So the display operation is pretty easy to implement, and the key thing in this example is basically the forwarding part. How do we forward a request from controller to a view, and this is how we can do it. Now let's implement the add comment part. So again, well, let's stop the server while we making changes to the code. Again, we start with the old servlet implementation. We look at each method, and we notice that doPost seems to be doing its job, and that is processing user input, and doGet is not doing something it's supposed to do, and now it's generating HTML, and we know that that's the view's job. So we'll create a JSP, and we'll get rid of this part of the code. Now, before we do that, let me mention something about implementing form processing operations. Processing forms is it's very common in web applications. We already know that. And if we look at a form processing operation like adding a comment, notice that strictly speaking, there are two actions involved here. One is to display the form, and one is to process the form. So strictly speaking, we would need to have two controllers. One is for displaying the form, and then one is for handling the submitted data. But it's customary for servlet to implement both of actions inside using one servlet, because these two actions are closely related, and when we use servlet, they can be naturally separated into doGet and doPost method. So although typically there are two actions involved, it's customary to use one servlet to implement both actions. But this is more an exception rather than a rule. In generally speaking, we would want to use one servlet for each action, but the form processing is the exception. Okay, so with that said, let's create our add comment JSP. And again, I'm going to place it under webinf, and I'm going to call it add comment. And this one is going to have a form, and the action is, of course, add comment, and the method will be post. And we need a name and message, so name is a text field, and message will use text area, so text area, name is message. And what did we do here? Just a text area, nothing else. Okay, so text area, and then a submit button. Name is add, value is add. Something like this. So this is our view. Notice that there's nothing JSP here. It's really just an HTML file, and that's perfectly fine. And with that, we can get rid of all the tedious output here, and simply say request get request dispatcher, and we'll dispatch it to add comment.jsp, and then we'll do forward request and response. So this part is very much like the guestbook example. We just receive this request and then just send it over to JSP, and that's that. Now, if we look at the doPost code, inside doPost we get name, we get message, we create a new entry, add it to the entry, and then redirect back to guestbook. Okay, looks good. And then let's give it a try. Oh, before we do that, let's add a link to add comment here. So we'll say add comment, and then add comment. Okay, let's run this. And the guestbook, we have our display, add comment, we have name and the message, and let's say my son says hello. Okay, it works, and that is expected. So first of all, again, because our servlet version is already a pretty well structured web application, in the sense that we have a proper model class, and then we separate each operation into a servlet. So it's again pretty straightforward to convert it into a MVC version, where the controller simply gets rid of all the code that display the the page and then separate that part of the page in JSP. But more importantly, in this example, I'd like to point out the difference between forward and redirect. So in this example, we saw two similar operations, but they are quite different in some other aspect. So the first operation we can see here is a forward operation in doGet, and the second operation we see here in doPause is a redirect. So what is the difference between a forward and a redirect? The difference is illustrated in on this slide. So on the left-hand side is a forward. So a forward, notice that involves only one request. The client or the browser sends a request, and the request first reaches the controller, which here is a servlet, and then the servlet takes the same request and then pass it on to the JSP, and then the JSP is used to generate the response. Notice that the whole process only has one request, and this one request gets passed from a servlet to JSP. Now, if you look at, for example, when we click Add Comment, notice that the URL is the URL of the servlet. And even though the request is passed on to a JSP behind the scene, the browser doesn't know that. So in the browser's address bar, you only see the address of the servlet, although on the server side, this request actually is passed on to a JSP and the response is actually generated by the JSP. So key thing here for forwarding is that there's only one request. So what happens to a redirect? The redirect works like this. The browser sends a request to a controller or servlet, and the servlet sends back a response, and that response is a redirect response. Upon receiving that response, and because it tells the browser to redirect, the browser immediately sends another request to the redirected location or redirected URL, and that location or URL will send back another response. And notice that here, redirect involves two requests, and this difference is kind of important because as we know, there are 4 scopes in Java web applications: the application scope, session scope, request scope, and the page scope. So notice that the data stored in request scope will remain valid after a forward because it's still the same request. However, data stored in request scope will no longer be valid after a redirect because it involves a second request, right? So if you want to keep data across multiple requests, you need to use at least session scope. And so going to the redirect example, let's say we type in something and we type in, let's say, hello again. So first of all, notice that the action is add comment, right? So if we click add, this request is submitted to add comment, and pay attention to the URL here. If I click add comment, notice that although the request is sent to add comment, somehow the address bar here shows guestbook, and that's because the original request is indeed sent to add comment, but because of the redirect response, the browser will send immediately another request to the guestbook URL, and that's why the address bar has changed to guestbook. And this is different from the forward because the forward in the forward case, there's no change in the address bar. So hopefully this illustrates the difference between forward and request, and that's that. And one last thing about redirect and forward is that if you look at our diagram, it says that for each operation we need to have a controller, and then we have a view, and the view is responsible for generating the response back. And if we look at our add comment code, so the do-get part, or the action that display the form, is okay. So the controller receives the request, and then the controller pass the request on to a JSP or a view, and it generates a response. But what about the do post part? In the do post part, the controller receives the request, process the data, and then where is the view in do post? Well, this is actually the view in do post. In web development, redirect is considered a special view. So a view doesn't have to be a JSP, although most of the time it is. But redirect is considered a special view. So in the do post action, it's still following our MVC architecture, where we have controller, we have view, except that this time the view is a redirect. Okay, so this is the add comment example, and then let's implement the edit comment part. To implement edit comment, we'll create an edit link here, and that's what we'll do. Let's stop the server again and go back to our JSP, and we'll add another column. We'll call this column operations, and we'll create an edit operation. So for edit operation, we'll create a link, and what's the URL? The URL is edit comment. Okay, it's edit comment, and we need to know which entry to edit. So we'll do an entry.id here to pass an ID request parameter. And yeah, this looks okay. And then time to look at edit comment servlet again. So to make this a controller, all the processing code remains, all the displayed code removed and put it into a JSP. So get entry to retrieve an entry from the entry list that is processing, leave it here, and do get. Okay, so this bunch of code needs to go to a JSP, and do post seems to be okay. Okay, so let's create our JSP, and that JSP should look quite similar to add comment. So let's make a copy of that. And in edit comment, we do edit comment, we do edit comment, and then name and then message. And then we say save instead of add. Okay, so this is basically this part of the code, except one thing. In an edit form, we are supposed to prefill the form with existing data. So we should have entry name here, entry message here, and in other words, here and here. So the data is in here. We get the entry from the entry list using the ID. The question now here is, how do we pass this entry to JSP so that we can display it. And that is the key thing in this example, is to how to pass additional data from a controller to a view. So notice that in the display action or display operation, we simply forward the request to the view because the data is already in application scope. But here we have some data here which is not in application scope, and we want to pass that to the JSP. And to do that, we need to utilize another scope, and that will be the request scope. Notice that although you can pass the data using application and session scope, you probably don't want to do that because this data is specific for only this request. If you, for example, save it in application scope, then when multiple users trying to edit comments on the same guestbook, they will conflict with each other. So you want to use the most restrictive scope to avoid conflicts between users, and here that will be the request scope. Request scope is quite easy to use, and just like other scopes, you have set attributes and get attributes, and this time the set attribute method is in the request, and that's that. So in order to pass data to the JSP, we simply say request set attribute and give it any name, and then we do the request dispatcher thing just like before with a get request dispatcher, and then web info edit comment JSP, and then forward request and the response. And that's more or less it. Now we can get rid of all the display code from here. And then here, now we know that there's a request scope. There's a request scope attribute called entry. So we can do value is entry.name. And here we have entry.message. And then remember that when we submit, we need to add additional parameter ID so that the do post part knows which entry we're editing. And for that, we'll add a hidden form field, and that will be type hidden. Name is ID and value is entry.id. Okay, so this should do it, and yeah, looks good. So if you look at this code and comparing it to add comment, notice that the main difference is really just parsing some additional data to the JSP, and you can do that by saving the data in request scope. So let's run this. And the guestbook, add something, and then edit something. So it works, of course. And again, this example, the main thing is how to send additional data from controller to view. If they are already in application or session scope, you don't need to do anything, otherwise use the request scope. And the reason you can use request scope is, again, because it's a forward, and anything in the request scope will remain valid after you forward the request. Okay, so that's about it for the example. As you can see, if your original servlet code is already well structured, having model classes, one servlet for each operation, and so on, it's pretty straightforward to convert it into an MVC version. All you need to do is basically taking the display code out of the servlets and put them in a JSP. Here are a few more things I want to emphasize regarding MVC. First, the MVC architecture doesn't say how simple or how complex a controller should be. So in theory, you can have one big controller for the whole application. You just need to put lots of if and else statements in it. And that actually happened before in previous classes. But if you do that, you kind of defeat the purpose of using MVC in the first place, and your code again becomes quite complex. It's going to be very difficult to write, to debug, to maintain, and so on. So remember that you should create one controller for each operation. And for example, in our guestbook example, we have a controller for display, controller for add, controller for edit. And by doing that, you separate those operations so you can develop, debug, and maintain each operation separately without affecting each other. And that makes development and maintain the code long-term a lot easier. So very important. One operation, one controller. Also, to keep your application MVC, remember that the request should always be sent to controllers, as shown in here, request controller. And you can hide your JSP pages under the webInf folder so the user cannot access them directly. And that's pretty beneficial. In fact, if you don't put guestbook JSP under web info, for example, if you put it under web content, then the user may be tempted to do guestbook JSP directly. But without going through the guestbook controller, it won't have it may not have the data needed in order to generate the response correctly. So a good practice is to hide your JSPs from direct access. And of course, controller should not generate response directly. That's views drop. So make sure you don't have out.println statements in your servlet code anymore. And last but not least, JSPs are used for display, not processing. So do not use creeping elements in JSP. And that's the end of this lesson.